What is the Book of Revelation? For millions, it's the Bible's final, terrifying chapter. A divine roadmap to the end of the world, filled with plagues, beasts, and cosmic war. We're told it's a singular vision, received by a single man, exiled on the island of Patmos. For 2,000 years, that's been the story. But what if that story isn't true? This is the untold story of how the apocalypse was forged, fought over, and ultimately hijacked. What if the most influential prophecy ever written wasn't a prophecy at all, but a brilliant piece of political propaganda? And what if the apocalypse's biggest secret has nothing to do with cryptic symbols, but with how it was made? If you look closer at the evidence, the history, the words themselves, the furious debates of the early church, a much more complex and much more human story emerges. To solve the mystery, you first have to understand the legend. For nearly 2,000 years, the authorship of Revelation was, for most Christians, a settled fact. The author was John. Not just any John, but John the Apostle, son of Zebedee, the disciple whom Jesus loved. He was in the inner circle, a man who walked with Jesus, saw his transfiguration, and stood at the foot of the cross. The story goes that in his old age, around 95 AD, during a wave of Roman persecution under the Emperor Domitian, John was exiled to the desolate Greek island of Patmos for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus. It's there, supposedly in a cave overlooking the Aegean Sea, that the veil between heaven and earth was torn open. The author himself says, "I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation, was on the island called Patmos." What follows is a torrent of visions, letters to 7 churches, 7 seals being broken, 7 trumpets sounding, and 7 bowls of wrath poured out. It's a phantasmagoria of celestial warfare, monstrous beasts, and the final, triumphant return of Christ. This traditional view wasn't just pulled from thin air. It was cemented by some of the most powerful thinkers in the early church. In the mid-2nd century, just a generation or two after the book was written, the philosopher Saint Justin Martyr was the first to state that John the Apostle was the seer of Patmos. This claim was soon echoed by giants of Christian thought like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Clement of Alexandria. By the time one of the first lists of New Testament books was compiled, the apostolic authorship of Revelation was presented as a known fact. This was crucial. In a world swimming with other gospels and alternative Christian ideas, linking a book directly to an apostle, a first-hand witness, gave it unquestionable authority. The logic was simple. Who better to receive the final word on Christ's return than the last living man who had known him in the flesh? This connection transformed the book. It wasn't just another apocalyptic text. It was the apocalypse. Its terrifying images weren't the ravings of some unknown mystic, but the certified vision of one of Jesus's closest friends. For centuries, this was the bedrock of the book's authority, a direct line from God to Jesus, to John, to the world. The story was sealed. But even as this official history was being written, a few dissenting voices began to whisper that something was wrong, that the foundation wasn't built on stone, but on sand. The solid consensus around the Apostle John's authorship began to crack surprisingly early. And the first major challenge didn't come from an outsider, but from one of the sharpest minds in the 3rd century church, Dionysius, the Bishop of Alexandria. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the Roman Empire, and Dionysius was a man who read texts not just with faith, but with a critical eye. Around 250 AD, Dionysius was in a theological fight. An Egyptian bishop named Nepos was using Revelation's promise of a literal 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth to promote a very physical, materialistic view of heaven. To counter this, Dionysius did something remarkable for his time. He performed a close literary analysis, comparing the book of Revelation to the Gospel of John, also attributed to the Apostle. His conclusions, saved for us by the church historian Eusebius, were stunning. Dionysius argued there was no way the same person wrote both books. He pointed out that the author of the Gospel and its letters famously never uses his own name, only calling himself the disciple whom Jesus loved. The author of Revelation, however, names himself John 4 separate times right at the start. A huge difference in style. But Dionysius went deeper, into the very language. He described the Greek in the Gospel of John as elegant and sophisticated. The Greek in Revelation, he said, was jarring, full of barbaric expressions and awkward grammar, errors suggesting the author wasn't a native or skilled Greek writer. The vocabulary, the themes, everything was different. The Gospel speaks of life and light. Revelation is obsessed with clouds and judgment. For Dionysius, the stylistic gap was just too wide. He concluded that while Revelation was a holy book, it must have been written by another John, not the Apostle. His critique was so powerful, it cast a long shadow, especially over the Eastern Greek-speaking parts of the Church, where Revelation's place in the Bible remained shaky for centuries. A century later, the historian Eusebius picked up on these doubts. He unearthed a cryptic fragment from an earlier writer named Papias, who mentioned learning from two different figures in Asia Minor, John the Apostle and another man he called John the Elder. Eusebius pounced on this. Could this be Dionysius's mysterious second John? He proposed that this lesser-known elder, not the famous apostle, was the true author. Suddenly, there was another suspect. Other, more extreme voices had even tried to attribute the book to a known heretic, Cerinthus, though this view was quickly dismissed. But these early debates prove one thing. The story of the lone apostle was never universally accepted. From the Church's own intellectual heart, scholars were raising serious evidence-based objections, suggesting the identity of the man on Patmos was a mystery to be solved, not a fact to be taken on faith. With the apostle's authorship in doubt, the case file widens. If not John the Apostle, then who? The prime suspect, thanks to Eusebius, is John the Elder. But who was he? The evidence is frustratingly thin, hanging almost entirely on that one ambiguous sentence from Papias, who mentioned learning from John the Apostle and also from John the Elder. Eusebius saw two different men. This theory neatly solves the problem. It explains the shared name and location without forcing the wildly different writing styles into the same hand. The John the Elder theory has remained popular for centuries, but the evidence is purely circumstantial. His entire existence hangs by the thread of one interpretation of one sentence. With the case for the elder being intriguing but inconclusive, other suspects have been proposed. Some suggest John Mark, a companion of Paul and Peter. Others have even floated the idea of a resurrected John the Baptist. These theories have very little evidence and are mostly dismissed. A more significant theory is pseudonymity. In the ancient world, it was common to write a text under the name of a famous figure to give it more weight, especially for apocalyptic literature. So, was John a pen name? An unknown prophet borrowing the apostle's fame? Maybe, but it doesn't quite fit. The author of Revelation presents himself as a contemporary, a brother and partner in tribulation to his audience. He doesn't say, "I am the apostle who walked with Jesus 60 years ago." He just says, "I am John." This suggests he was a real person, known to the 7 churches he was writing to. He didn't need to borrow the apostle's fame because he had his own. This brings us back to square one, a real prophet named John in Asia Minor, who likely wasn't the apostle. But each of these theories focuses on finding a single author. What if that's the mistake? What if the book's clashing styles aren't the mark of one author, but the fingerprints of many? This leads to the most radical theory of all, that Revelation wasn't written but assembled, that it was hijacked to become the Christian apocalypse we know today. Here, the investigation takes a sharp turn. What if the core of Revelation isn't Christian at all? A controversial but fascinating scholarly theory suggests that the book began as a Jewish text born from the fury of the Jewish people after a terrible tragedy, and was only later edited and repurposed by a Christian author to serve a new agenda. This idea starts with a simple observation. The world of Revelation feels intensely Jewish. The book is saturated with the language and imagery of the Hebrew Bible. Daniel, Ezekiel, Isaiah. The number of allusions is staggering. The author thinks in Old Testament patterns, sevens, 12s, temple imagery, cosmic battles. These are all staples of Jewish apocalyptic thought that existed long before Christianity. The historical context makes this plausible. The book is dated around 95 AD, just 25 years after the most traumatic event in first-century Judaism, the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple by Rome in 70 AD. As some scholars like Elaine Pagels have argued, the author writes like a refugee from that war. The book is war literature, a raw cry for vengeance against the Roman enemy, which he calls Babylon the Great. This theory posits that an original Jewish apocalypse was written in this period, a vision of God's revenge on the empire that desecrated his holy city. So where does Jesus fit in? According to this hypothesis, a later Christian editor Christianized the text. They went through and inserted references to Jesus. The messianic warrior becomes Jesus. The lamb that was slain is added to connect the drama to the crucifixion. The letters to the 7 churches could have been added as a Christian frame at the beginning. It's a powerful idea. If you were to mentally remove the explicitly Christian verses, you'd be left with a coherent Jewish apocalypse. This would explain the strange seams and abrupt shifts in tone. It wouldn't be one vision, but a layered text, a palimpsest, where a Christian message was written over a Jewish original. However, this theory remains on the fringe for a critical reason. There is no physical evidence. We have no copies of a purely Jewish version of Revelation. The earliest manuscripts we have are all thoroughly Christian. The mainstream consensus today is that the book was written as a whole by a single Jewish Christian author who was naturally steeped in his own scriptures. But the Jewish source theory refuses to die because it elegantly explains so many of the book's puzzles, like its central character. Is he the conquering lion of Judah or the sacrificed lamb? This theory suggests he was originally the lion, and the lamb was a later Christian reinterpretation. It may be the first hint of what hijacking the apocalypse really means. This brings us to the climax of our investigation. We've seen the official story doubted, considered a lineup of suspects, and explored the explosive possibility of a Jewish original. Now we can combine these threads into one comprehensive theory. The book of Revelation wasn't the work of one man, but the product of a collective. A school of prophets battling to define the ultimate vision of the end. Let's imagine the scene. Late 1st century, Asia Minor. The Christian communities are in crisis. Jerusalem is gone, the apostles are dead, and persecution is a constant threat. But the danger isn't just from Rome, it's from within. The Christian movement is fracturing. On one side are followers of Paul, teaching a message of grace and accommodation with the surrounding culture. On the other are more conservative, likely Jewish Christian groups who see any compromise with Roman society as demonic. It's likely from this second group that Revelation was born. Our John wasn't just a lone prophet, he was the voice of a movement that felt other Christians were getting dangerously soft. The letters to the 7 churches are filled with warnings against compromise, blasting churches for tolerating those who eat food, sacrifice to idols, or follow a false prophetess named Jezebel. These are attacks aimed at other Christians. This John was likely the leader of a prophetic circle or a Johannine school, locked in a struggle for the soul of Christianity. They may have found a powerful Jewish apocalypse that captured their anti-Roman fury and began to rework it, adding the letters, inserting the figure of the Lamb, and reframing it for their own theological battles. The book's stylistic oddities aren't the mistakes of a bad writer. They're the seams showing where different sources or the work of different hands were stitched together. Think of it as a writer's room for the apocalypse, with John putting his name on the final product. But the hijacking doesn't stop there. As scholar Elaine Pagels has shown, the first few centuries were full of competing apocalypses. The apocalypse of Peter, Gnostic revelations, many with a totally different vision of the end, focused on inner spiritual enlightenment, not cosmic genocide. John's revelation was, in part, an argument against these other apocalypses. Its terrifying black and white vision of saved versus damned sought to marginalize all competing narratives. It was a power play, and it worked. When church leaders like Athanasius decided which books to include in the New Testament, they faced a choice. They could choose the apocalypses of inner light, or John's fiery vision of clear enemies and absolute judgment. For an institution trying to unify its doctrine in a hostile world, the choice was clear. John's revelation, with its powerful us versus them mentality, was an invaluable tool for building a unified church. It was chosen, and the others were mostly suppressed and lost to history. So why does this ancient literary mystery matter? Because understanding that the apocalypse was likely a human manifesto forged in a time of crisis completely reframes its legacy. When we see it as a human document, not a divine blueprint, its power and its danger become much clearer. First, it decodes the book's terrifying prophecies. The beasts, the number 66, the whore of Babylon. These weren't predictions for our time. They were political cartoons attacking the Roman Empire. The number 6666, through a form of Hebrew numerology called gematria, almost certainly points to the Emperor Nero, the first great persecutor of Christians, whose name in Hebrew letters added up to that number. John's apocalypse was a fiery commentary on his present, an act of resistance, assuring his followers that God, not Caesar, was in control. It's not a source of anxiety, but a testament to the resilience of a community fighting back with words. Second, seeing the book as part of an internal Christian conflict reveals the origin of a dangerous idea, the demonization of one's opponents. John's vision divides the world into absolute good and absolute evil. There is no middle ground. His enemies aren't just wrong, they are followers of Satan. This wartime mentality was incredibly effective for building a movement, but because it was canonized, it was enshrined in the Christian tradition. Throughout history, its language has been used to justify crusades, inquisitions, and wars whenever a group wanted to portray its enemies as satanic. Finally, this investigation reveals that the vision of the apocalypse was just one among many. By choosing John's revelation, the early church silenced other, perhaps more hopeful visions of the end, ones that spoke of inner enlightenment and universal salvation. We are the heirs of the version that won, the one that emphasized judgment and division. This doesn't mean we should discard the book. It remains a work of staggering literary power. But it does mean we must read it with new eyes, not as a crystal ball, but as a historical artifact. It invites us to look past the terrifying images and ask deeper questions. How do we resist oppression? How do we hold on to hope after trauma? And what are the dangers of seeing the world in only black and white? This journey into the past is just one of many mysteries hidden in ancient texts. If you find these kinds of hidden histories fascinating, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. Now, let us know in the comments. What do you think? Was Revelation written by a single apostle, or was the apocalypse hijacked?